As long as man continues to be the ruthless destroyer of lower living beings, he will never know health or peace, for as long as men massacre animals, they will kill each other. Indeed, he who sows the seeds of murder and pain cannot reap joy and love. These comments were made around the year 500 BCE by the ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras. Back in ancient Creton, Pythagoras' decision to eliminate meat from his diet was considered unusual. What's more, his aversion to hunters and butchers was labelled a mark of eccentricity. Pythagoras, though, saw his behaviour as a rational objection to all forms of killing, and consequently protested the consumption of meat on the grounds that it was immoral. In the 2500 years that followed, many demonstrated solidarity with this thought, and adopted so-called Pythagorean diets as a result. St. Anthony of Egypt, Leonardo da Vinci, Jeremy Bentham. Eventually, in 1847, the British Vegetarian Society was formed, finally giving a familiar name to this growing movement. Interestingly, one of the most ardent and historic proponents of vegetarianism was Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. As well as being one of Russia's, if not the world's, most renowned novelists, Tolstoy was also a great mind in philosophy, and wrote extensively on matters of aesthetics, civil disobedience, and the philosophy of killing. The latter especially was of great interest to him, and formed the foundation for his views on vegetarianism. In a letter to Dr. Eugene Heinrich Schmidt, Tolstoy quite strongly remarks, "A man can live and be healthy without killing animals for food. Therefore, if he eats meat, he participates in taking animal life merely for the sake of his appetite, and to act so is immoral." These are quite strong words from the literary giant, but what's more interesting is the wording. It is the taking of animal life merely for the sake of appetite that Tolstoy regards as immoral, not necessarily the suffering of animals themselves. This makes one wonder, what exactly was Tolstoy's philosophy on vegetarianism? Perhaps the clearest explanation of his views can be found in a preface he wrote for the Russian translation of The Ethics of Diet, in which he details how he visited a slaughterhouse in the town of Tula because he had wished to see with his own eyes the reality of the question raised when vegetarianism is discussed. Recalling the event shortly after, he describes in quite graphic detail the many things that he witnessed there, the majority of which surround the gruesome process by which oxen and other animals were put to death. However, Tolstoy's attention during this visit was not on the animals, but on the butchers themselves. One instance, for example, saw him observe two butchers conversing casually whilst going about their duties. The butcher, still continuing the conversation, grasped with his left hand the head of the ram and cut its throat, he narrates. The ram quivered and the little tail stiffened and ceased to wave. The fellow, while waiting for the blood to flow, began to relight his cigarette which had gone out. The blood flowed and the ram began to writhe. The conversation continued without the slightest interruption. It was horribly revolting. The cause of Tolstoy's revulsion here, curiously, isn't owed to the suffering of the ram, but rather the callousness with which the men acted towards it. Tolstoy believed that the killing of animals shows a disregard for the divinity of human empathy. Accordingly, he worries, if we suspend our empathy towards animals merely for the sake of appetite, what is to stop us from growing accustomed to not exercising it towards people as well? Man has a strong aversion to all killing, but to forsake this for the purposes of greediness, he says, will cause us to entirely lose this natural feeling. Tolstoy expands upon this view within the same preface, whereby he details an interesting interaction between himself and a butcher. The butcher was surprised at Tolstoy's assertion that it was a pity to kill, but afterwards agreed with him, remarking, "Especially when they are quiet, tame cattle. They come, poor things, trusting you. It is very pitiful." Of this, Tolstoy has some strong opinions. "This is dreadful," he writes, "not the suffering and death of the animals, but that man suppresses in himself unnecessarily the highest spiritual capacity, that of sympathy and pity towards living creatures like himself, and by violating his own feelings becomes cruel. And how deeply seated in the human heart is the injunction not to take life." So again, his grievance is that the killing of animals in some sense violates man's spiritual capacity for empathy, as it asks us to suppress it within himself. This is quite a novel argument and therefore avoids the usual resistance faced by vegetarian ethics. For example, it avoids saying that we have a custodial duty of care towards animals, which is for the best as these sorts of claims are regularly disputed. Instead, it adopts an anthropocentric approach, dealing directly with the practical morality of killing animals and what this does to us as people. Curiously, a similar sentiment can be found in the writings of the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. Although Kant does not think we have any duties towards animals, and therefore are not strictly obliged to act ethically towards them, he does however think that cruelty to animals is contrary to man's duty to himself, because it deadens in him the feeling of sympathy for their sufferings. As a result, he explains, a natural tendency that is very useful to morality in relation to other humans is weakened. Again, what's interesting about this is that neither man is explicitly claiming that the suffering of animals is wrong per se, but rather that by affecting it, it leads to undesirable long-term consequences for us. Tolstoy raises a second objection to the consumption of meat, one of self-control. Exercising self-control is important, Tolstoy says, as it involves mastery over one's nature. As a result, it's critical to exercise self-control in all aspects of one's life, including what we eat. But what kind of self-control ought we exercise in our diet? To this, Tolstoy answers, if he be really and seriously seeking to live a good life, the first thing from which he will abstain will always be the use of animal food. Why? Because the killing of animals is an issue that inherits considerable complications. Without even taking into account the suffering of animals, there are ethical issues like the ones previously raised, theological issues surrounding the dominion of man over beast, and also practical issues of the treatment and sanitary upkeep of the animals. If we are to eat, why eat something so riddled with controversy when there are better, less questionable food options available? Tolstoy isn't just gunning for non-Pythagoreans here, he's aiming to make a broader point. Self-control is what separates us from animals. It's an awareness of the context surrounding our actions and habits. Let us imagine a clothes retailer, for example, embroiled in a sweatshop or child labour scandal. Imagining this is not too difficult, but I digress. Frequenting such a business in this scenario would show a lack of awareness, a lack of self-control. That is because in doing so, it is clear that we understand how our patronage ultimately perpetuates unethical labour, but we submit to indifference towards it nonetheless, even though we recognise our own complicity and the fact that the labour practices in question are wrong. This, Tolstoy argues, is shameful. To forsake our moral instincts for greed is not only irrational, but ignoble, unfitting of our divine qualities. It's a very emotive but contentious argument he makes here. Accordingly, he applies the same rationale to meat eating. An appetite for meat, he surmises, is simply immoral, as it is called forth only by greediness and the desire for tasty food. So, what can we take from it all? That in order to be moral, people must cease to eat meat? Not at all, he says, but rather that the killing of animals for the sake of food is a gross excess, and in doing so we not only expose a lack of self-control, but also unjustifiably risk the erosion of our human empathy. In line with this, vegetarianism is a sign that the aspiration of mankind towards moral perfection is serious and sincere, and a movement that should cause a special joy to those whose life lies in the effort to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. To Tolstoy's presumed content, this movement is still on the rise. A 2014 survey by the Heinrich Böll Foundation reported that 15 million people in the US identify as vegetarian, a figure that constitutes approximately 4% of the male population and 7% of the female population. In Europe, the same survey estimates that between 2 to 10% of the total population are vegetarian. The time will come, predicts Merezhkovsky, where men such as him will look on the murder of animals as they now look on the murder of men. It would seem that this time is slowly but surely approaching. It's certainly come a long way since Pythagoras. Even if we remain unconvinced by Tolstoy's arguments, they do rightly encourage us to examine our habits. What kind of products, meat, textile and otherwise, do we consume without considering their consequences? Are there similar and less controversial options available? And if so, ought we not consider them? And if you are convinced by Tolstoy's arguments or are vegetarian already, and find yourself disappointed by the speed or momentum of the vegetarian movement, perhaps Tolstoy's words on the matter might bring you some comfort. The moral progress of humanity, which is the foundation of every other kind of progress, is always slow. But that is the sign of true, not casual progress, its uninterruptedness and its continual acceleration. And the progress of vegetarianism is of this kind. And I'm afraid that is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. I picked this topic as I thought these kind of arguments are rarely talked about today and do provide some engaging food for thought, no pun intended, about vegetarianism. as well as offering, of course, a useful insight into Tolstoy's general philosophy. So yes, hopefully you enjoyed it, and if so, please show your support by liking this video, and indeed commenting your thoughts. Additionally, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and a great way of helping more people see our content. Another great way is by sharing our videos with friends. Don't forget, there's plenty more content on the channel. Please do have a digital wonder, and remember to hit that notification bell so that you know whenever we release a new video. As always everyone, thank you for watching.